January 1943. Above the steaming waters of the Solomon Sea, the sun glinted off the curved canopy of a formation of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, their sleek lines cutting the sky with elegance born of Japanese precision engineering. Below them, a new and unfamiliar silhouette appeared, bouncing awkwardly on its long, stubby landing gear as it struggled to maintain formation, the Vought F4U Corsair. Its inverted gull wings, at first glance a stylistic quirk, made the aircraft appear even larger, almost grotesque, in the eyes of the experienced Japanese pilots. The engine of the early Corsair coughed and sputtered under the strain of climb, and the heavy radial seemed to labor for every foot of altitude. From the rear cockpit of his Zero, Lieutenant Takeshi Nakamura of the Tainan Air Group couldn't suppress a grin. "Waist-high gulls," he muttered to his wingman, a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "Look at them flounder. Do they even know which way is up?" Around him, laughter rippled through the formation, a sound that carried over the cloudless morning sky. The Corsairs, with their powerful yet temperamental Pratt and Whitney R2800 double wasp engines, seemed more like overgrown seaplanes than the agile fighters these men were accustomed to. In the early days, these waist-high gulls were cumbersome, prone to landing accidents, and difficult to handle at low speeds, a far cry from the nimble Zero, with its near-weightless controls and legendary turn radius. The Japanese pilots had reason to feel confident. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, introduced in 1940, had dominated the skies over China, the Philippines, and early Pacific engagements. Its lightweight construction, combined with long range and extreme maneuverability, had rendered Allied fighters vulnerable. American pilots flying Brewster Buffaloes or early F-4F Wildcats often found themselves outclassed, their planes torn apart in dogfights that lasted minutes, sometimes seconds. Japanese aircrews, trained rigorously in aerial tactics and steeped in the philosophy of climbing to gain positional advantage, then striking with coordinated precision, had come to expect victory. The arrival of the Corsair, at least in these early encounters, seemed a minor curiosity rather than a threat. Yet behind the smiles and mocking chatter, a subtle unease threaded through the Zero's formation. The Allied forces were adapting, rapidly integrating the new fighter into carrier decks and forward airfields, sometimes at great risk. Engineers and pilots alike had labored over the Corsair's teething problems. The aircraft's long nose and narrow undercarriage caused notorious landing difficulties on carriers, and early flights suffered from tailwheel collapses and torque-induced rolls on takeoff. Even so, U.S. Navy and Marine Corps personnel persisted, their doctrine emphasizing mass production and iterative improvement over initial perfection. Where Japanese design had pursued nimble, fighters optimized for dogfighting, the Americans were building planes that could survive punishment, carry heavy payloads, and eventually dominate with raw horsepower. The contrast between the two forces was immediate. The Zero could dance across the sky, slipping through turns that would snap the wings off any other fighter. It could climb with ease, banking and rolling in a display of aerodynamic grace. The Corsair, by contrast, lumbered. Its fuselage seemed wide, almost portly, and its wing loading made turning sluggish. Observing the first Corsairs in combat, Japanese intelligence noted the aircraft's imperfections: difficult handling at low speeds, a tendency to stall, and, in many cases, pilots struggling to bring it under control. For seasoned Japanese aces, this reinforced their sense of superiority. Yet appearances, as the Zeros would soon discover, were deceptive. The Corsair's Pratt and Whitney R2800 engine, capable of producing 2,000 horsepower in early models, masked a revolutionary potential. Where the Zero relied on lightweight construction to achieve performance, the Corsair employed brute force, overbuilt structures, and massive armament to redefine what a fighter could accomplish. Early encounters over Guadalcanal hinted at this latent power. American pilots, often green and untested in the Pacific theater, were still learning the aircraft's quirks. Yet even inexperienced aviators could leverage the Corsair's diving speed and firepower to devastating effect once they understood the principles of energy fighting, attacking from high altitude, using momentum to avoid prolonged turning engagements, and concentrating their fire. The U.S. Navy's strategy in late 1942 and early 1943 emphasized incremental mastery. Corsairs deployed from carriers such as the USS Saratoga and the USS Essex underwent intensive shakedown operations, while the Marine Corps experimented with land-based deployment from Henderson Field and nearby airstrips. Pilots practiced carrier landings, gunnery, formation flying, and coordination with bombers and scout planes. The aircraft's reputation as difficult to fly diminished as skill and experience accumulated. By mid-1943, American squadrons began reporting the first glimpses of what the Corsair could do when handled properly, a combination of speed, survivability, and firepower that would eventually earn the aircraft its legendary status. Back over the Solomon Sea, the Zero's laughter remained, but cracks in confidence began to form. Lieutenant Nakamura noticed a Corsair peeling out of a dive with surprising acceleration. The engine whining but stable, the pilot recovering from a maneuver that would have left other planes in a spin. His wingman, Midshipman Haruto Sato, saw tracer lines converge in the sky with uncanny precision. The Corsair's 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns singing in deadly harmony. Several Japanese pilots, already confident in their skills, began to question their assumptions. Could these ungainly American planes survive hits that would destroy a Zero? Could raw horsepower and overbuilt engineering overcome maneuverability? The initial contempt of the Japanese aviators reflected both experience and hubris. They had never faced an opponent who thought in terms of industrial capacity as much as tactical finesse. Where the Zero represented perfection of design for a particular mission, the Corsair embodied a philosophy that anticipated loss, compensated with redundancy, and leveraged overwhelming power. Early jokes about waist-high gulls carried with them the unspoken assumption that victory in aerial combat depended on pilot skill alone. They had yet to understand that American strategy integrated design, training, and logistics into a single, devastating equation. The stage was being set. Across the Pacific, new Corsair squadrons were arriving. Pilots steadily mastering their machines, and engineers resolving lingering issues with engine reliability and landing gear failures. Every sortie over Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and Bougainville taught lessons that Japanese pilots could not yet see. The Zero's confidence, honed in campaigns over the Philippines, Malaya, and the early Pacific Islands, would soon collide with the blunt reality of mass production, raw firepower, and survivable airframes. By February 1943, small skirmishes began to hint at the Corsair's potential. A few isolated engagements revealed that, despite the Zero's superior turning ability, the Corsair could absorb damage that would cripple a Japanese fighter. Pilots reported surviving hits to the engine cowling and wings, returning to base with holes torn through fuselage and control surfaces intact. American gunnery, though initially unrefined, was capable of inflicting critical damage at range, leveraging 8 synchronized 50 caliber machine guns in concentrated bursts. In short, the waist-high gulls had hidden a deadly secret. And, so, above the Solomon Sea, the laughter echoed through Japanese cockpits, mocking the clumsy newcomers. Yet in that same laughter lay the seeds of apprehension. The war in the Pacific was entering a new phase, one in which American industrial logic and pilot training would confront Japanese tactical brilliance in a collision that neither side could fully anticipate. The Zeros had dominated the skies for years. They had laughed at the Corsair. But in the months to come, they would learn that power, armor, and firepower, backed by unyielding production, could change the rules of aerial combat forever. The first chapter of the Corsair's legend was written in these encounters. Mockery, doubt, and minor triumphs coexisted in the skies above Guadalcanal. For the Japanese, the Corsair seemed laughably unworthy of attention. For the Americans, it was a challenge, a puzzle to master, and a promise of victory in a war that demanded machines capable of survival, endurance, and destruction in equal measure. The stage had been set, the actors in place, and the Pacific sky, wide and indifferent, would soon bear witness to the transformation of laughter into fear, doubt into respect, and a new fighter into legend. March 15th, 1943. The sky above the Russell Islands shimmered under a brilliant tropical sun, the blue horizon stretching unbroken for miles. From Henderson Field, Marine pilots of VMF 121 prepared for yet another patrol over the Solomon Sea. Among them, Lieutenant Edward "Ed" Cartwright checked his F4U Corsair, the gull-winged fighter gleaming, its massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney R. 2,800 double-wasp engine rumbling like a living beast, unlike the Japanese Zeros he had faced in training simulations. This mission would confront him with the real enemy seasoned aviators of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 4th Air Group, pilots hardened by campaigns over New Guinea, the Philippines, and the Solomon Chain. Cartwright and his wingman, Second Lieutenant Samuel Hayes, taxied onto the runway, the Corsairs' long noses tilting forward, propellers slicing the air with thunderous force. Early Corsairs had earned a reputation for being unwieldy, challenging on takeoff and landing, but in the hands of these Marines, trained meticulously in the aircraft's idiosyncrasies, it had become a weapon capable of redefining aerial combat. Each Corsair carried 8 .50 caliber Browning machine guns, a combined rate of fire unmatched in the theater, a concentrated wall of lead that could reduce a Japanese Zero to fragments if deployed correctly. As Cartwright lifted off, the airfield receding beneath him, the first formation of Zeros appeared on the horizon. Led by Lieutenant Toshio Matsuda, a veteran of over 200 combat missions, the Japanese pilots tilted their wings in casual formation. They had seen the Corsairs before, observed them from afar, and shared jokes about their awkward appearance. "Look at them," Matsuda said, glancing at the advancing American fighters. "Gull-winged fools, our practice will be a moment's work." Around him, his flightmates laughed. There was a palpable confidence, a sense that skill and agility alone would suffice against the new machines. The first engagement began with a textbook approach. The Zeros dove with the sun at their backs, their nimbleness giving them a brief but lethal advantage. Cartwright's squadron had been briefed exhaustively. Do not engage in prolonged turning fights. The Corsairs' strength was not agility, it was speed, armor, and concentrated firepower. As the Japanese fighters swooped in, the Corsairs maintained altitude, trading position for energy. Cartwright's heart raced, the hum of the R-2800 filling his ears, the stick vibrating under his grip as he banked for the first attack pass. At 500 feet above the initial dive, Cartwright spotted his opportunity. 1 Zero, separated slightly from the formation, presented a clear target. Pulling the trigger, Cartwright unleashed a 2-second burst from all 8 guns, tracer rounds arcing perfectly toward the Japanese aircraft. The sound was mechanical, precise, unstoppable, a staccato thunder that the Zeros had never encountered. Tracers stitched across the fuselage, ripping through fabric, wing spars, and the thin metal skin. The Zero shuddered violently, control surfaces fluttering, the engine coughing and sputtering under the concentrated fire. Within seconds, Matsuda's wingman's craft spiraled downward in flames, the pilot ejecting at the last moment. The other Japanese pilots, initially bemused, were now forced to acknowledge the Corsairs' power. One after another, they experienced the concentrated firepower firsthand. The early assumption that these aircraft were fragile, easy to down, crumbled. The Corsair could absorb hits and remain controllable. Cartwright's own plane shivered as he maneuvered, bullets embedding in the fuselage and wings, yet the Corsair held. The Corsair's massive radial engine, overbuilt and armored, continued to push air through the propeller. It was not invincible, but it had proven something remarkable. Resilience in a way the Zeros had not anticipated. This was not mere luck or pilot heroics. The Corsair's design embodied a philosophy foreign to Japanese engineers. Where the Zero relied on extreme lightness to achieve maneuverability, the Corsair relied on brute strength. Every component was overbuilt. Wing spars capable of supporting tens of thousands of pounds, engine mounts reinforced to withstand high G-forces, control cables duplicated for redundancy. This allowed the pilots to exploit energy tactics fully, trading turns for speed, diving from high altitude with devastating effect, and concentrating fire in a precision kill zone that left no room for error from the enemy. During that first engagement, American pilots began to experiment instinctively with what would become known as boom and zoom tactics. Climbing above the enemy, Cartwright and his squadron would dive from high altitude, convert potential energy into lethal kinetic energy, unleash torrents of .50 caliber lead, and then use their superior speed to climb back into safety. Traditional dogfighting, the Japanese forte, became a trap when applied against these powerful machines. The Zeros could turn endlessly, but the Corsairs did not need to. They struck, they inflicted catastrophic damage, and they returned to altitude intact, ready for another pass. The psychological impact on the Japanese pilots was immediate. Laughter faded into confusion, then disbelief. Lieutenant Matsuda, observing the unfolding destruction, radioed a terse report to command. "These aircraft, they do not fall. Our fire cannot bring them down. One hit, and they continue. Their guns, there is nothing like it." Around him, his fellow pilots echoed the sentiment, each encounter chipping away at the overconfidence they had carried into battle for years. The first Corsair kills had been made, but the implications extended far beyond a single engagement. Back on the American side, debriefings recorded the first signs of what would become a pattern. Pilots noted the resilience of the Corsairs, the devastating effect of concentrated, .50 caliber fire, and the importance of altitude and energy tactics. The lessons were clear. Do not engage in turning fights, leverage speed and diving power, and trust in the aircraft's structure to absorb punishment. The Corsair, once derided for its quirks, began to reveal itself as a revolutionary weapon. Meanwhile, intelligence reports sent back to Tokyo painted a disturbing picture. Japanese officers, initially dismissive, began to take note of the growing number of Corsair kills and their apparent survivability. Post-war interrogations would reveal the depth of their concern. One officer, Lieutenant Commander Masao Tanaka, would later recount, "We had underestimated the Americans. We thought these machines were fragile, laughable. We did not understand that their pilots, their production, their strategy, all worked together." The Corsair was not just an aircraft, it was a statement. The significance of the first Corsair kills extended beyond individual encounters. The aircraft demonstrated that the United States could integrate industrial capacity, pilot training, and raw firepower into a single, coherent system. Where the Japanese had relied on exceptional pilots to overcome technological limitations, the Americans were beginning to prove that design philosophy and brute force engineering could redefine aerial combat. Each Corsair sortie, each burst of .50 caliber lead, sent a signal. The Pacific theater was entering a new phase, one in which the Japanese assumption of aerial supremacy could no longer be taken for granted. By the end of March 1943, the Japanese pilots' laughter had dimmed. Encounters over Guadalcanal, the Russell Islands, and New Georgia revealed a recurring truth. The Corsair was lethal, survivable, and backed by a strategy that allowed for continuous improvement. The Zeros could still maneuver, but the tactical calculus had shifted. A single burst from 8 synchronized machine guns could shred a fighter in seconds. And when combined with the Corsair's superior diving speed, engine power, and structural strength, the aircraft became a weapon that demanded respect. For the Americans, the early engagements were lessons written in fire and steel. Each pilot carried the knowledge that mastery of the Corsair required discipline, adherence to tactics, and trust in the machine. Each mission refined the doctrine, emphasizing energy fighting, situational awareness, and coordinated attacks. Over time, these lessons would form the foundation for the domination of the Solomon skies, setting the stage for victories that would culminate in the destruction of Japanese air power across the Pacific. The first Corsair kill, though small in isolation, echoed far beyond the Solomon Sea. It was the opening note of a symphony of industrial might, tactical innovation, and unyielding courage. For Japanese pilots, it was the moment when derision gave way to apprehension. For American pilots, it was the first taste of what their machine could truly accomplish. And for history, it marked the beginning of a transformation. The moment when the waist-high gulls began to rewrite the rules of air combat in the Pacific. April 1943. The Solomons were a crucible, a place where raw courage met industrial ingenuity in the unforgiving heat of the Pacific. Lieutenant Edward Cartwright and his fellow VMF 121 pilots had survived their first encounters with the Japanese 4th Air Group, but the lessons of March lingered like the scent of aviation fuel and scorched metal. The gull-winged Corsair, once the subject of mockery in Japanese mess halls, had begun to command respect, even fear, among seasoned enemy pilots. It was not just the aircraft itself, but the philosophy behind it: firepower, speed, structural resilience that began to redefine air combat. Cartwright and his wingman Samuel Hayes prepared for another patrol from Henderson Field. The briefing room buzzed with the same nervous energy that had defined every pre-flight gathering over the past months. Intelligence reports had indicated increased Zero activity near Tulagi and Guadalcanal, including veteran aces known for ruthless efficiency. "They've seen our planes survive," said Captain Robert Jennings, the squadron commander. "They're cautious now, but cautious doesn't mean careful. Stick to the plan. Altitude, energy, concentrated fire." The words were a mantra, drilled into the pilots with precision. The first sighting came mid-morning. From 30,000 feet, the American Corsairs observed the familiar dark silhouettes of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros converging toward the Solomon Sea. Unlike their first encounters, the Zeros were wary. Formation integrity tightened, dive angles moderated, and the usual taunts over the radio were absent. Lieutenant Matsuda, recalling his squadron's losses the previous month, gave terse commands. "Maintain height, avoid dives. They're guns, they are dangerous." His confidence, once unshakable, now carried an undercurrent of unease. The initial pass tested both sides' nerves. The Zeros attempted a high-speed climb to engage at an advantageous angle, exploiting their famed maneuverability. Cartwright's squadron remained calm, trading position and altitude for energy. The Corsairs' R-2800 engine roared, a mechanical leviathan pushing them through the sky with relentless force. It was in these moments that the aircraft revealed its true advantage. The massive radial engine maintained full power where the lighter Zeros gasped, their performance degrading at higher altitudes. Speed became their shield, firepower their sword. The first engagement of the day produced textbook results. A single Zero, attempting to break through the American formation, found itself in the convergence zone of a coordinated Corsair attack. 8.50 caliber machine guns unleashed a sustained torrent of tracer rounds. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The aircraft shuddered violently, the fuselage buckling under the concentrated fire. One wing folded, control surfaces shredded, and the pilot had mere seconds to bail out before gravity claimed the crippled fighter. Other Zeros, witnessing the carnage, adjusted tactics mid-flight, but the psychological impact was irreversible. The Corsair's reputation had begun to precede it. Post-engagement analysis became an obsession. Pilots meticulously recorded every detail: ranges, angles of attack, gun convergence settings, and energy management strategies. Lieutenant Hayes, reviewing gun camera footage, remarked, "It's not just firepower, it's predictability. You can place your rounds where they'll count every time." The Corsair's guns, synchronized and electrically boosted, allowed pilots to maintain continuous fire for critical seconds, far longer than the Japanese 20mm cannon could sustain without overheating or jamming. Every encounter reinforced the lesson. In the Pacific, the Corsair could absorb punishment and return it in spades. Japanese pilots were forced to adapt quickly. Interrogation reports post-war reveal the depth of their reassessment. Lieutenant Commander Masao Tanaka, reflecting on aerial battles in early April 1943, noted, "We had underestimated the Americans. The aircraft seemed awkward, unrefined, but our assumptions failed. They fought differently. They attacked with overwhelming force, then retreated before we could respond. Our tactics were no longer sufficient. Where once confidence and skill alone had been sufficient, the introduction of the Corsair demanded a new calculus: respect for raw power, recognition of pilot training, and an acknowledgement of American industrial capacity. This evolution of perception became particularly clear in mid-April. VMF-121 intercepted a mixed flight of Zeros conducting reconnaissance over Guadalcanal. Cartwright, flying the lead aircraft, noted a subtle but crucial change. The enemy was no longer initiating high-risk maneuvers without support. Their attacks were methodical, cautious, and at longer ranges than before. The Japanese pilots, aware of the Corsair's destructive potential, maintained altitude and distance, attempting to draw the Americans into turning engagements, a trap the Corsairs had been explicitly trained to avoid. The tactical innovation of the Americans complemented the aircraft's design perfectly. Boom and zoom attacks allowed Corsairs to exploit both speed and firepower while minimizing exposure to the Zero's turning superiority. After diving passes, pilots could climb to safety, reload, and repeat. Each successful attack reinforced Japanese caution and gradually eroded morale. Reports from captured officers in May 1943 highlight a consistent theme. The Corsairs' guns created an almost hypnotic zone of destruction. Encounters became psychological as well as physical contests. The roar of the R-2800 engine, combined with the staccato thunder of 50 caliber rounds, became a signal of inevitable death for enemy pilots. By the end of April, patterns emerged that would define Corsair combat doctrine. Pilots focused on energy retention, altitude advantage, and fire discipline. The aircraft's strengths, high-speed dives, robust construction, and concentrated machine gun fire formed the backbone of tactical thinking. Lessons learned in the Solomons were codified in debriefings. Avoid prolonged turning fights, maximize energy, maintain altitude, and strike decisively. These doctrines would later inform engagements across the Central and Western Pacific, providing a template for success against Japanese fighters who had once dominated the skies. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound. Officers noted the subtle changes in pilot behavior: hesitation in attacking, reluctance to pursue Corsairs aggressively, and a growing respect for the aircraft's resilience. Lieutenant Matsuda, previously confident in his squadron's ability to dominate, admitted in post-war interrogation, "We laughed at the gull-winged fools at first. We believed our skill was sufficient. After April, we no longer laughed. We saw what they could endure. We saw what they could do. Our assumptions were shattered." This shift in perception marked a turning point, a moment when mockery transformed into cautious respect. American pilots, for their part, gained confidence not from victories alone, but from understanding the aircraft's capabilities and limitations. Lieutenant Cartwright reflected, "The Corsair doesn't just fight. It teaches you how to fight. If you respect its strengths, it can carry you through almost anything. If you ignore them, it will remind you in the harshest way." This symbiosis of pilot skill and engineering brilliance was emblematic of the larger Allied approach. A fusion of technological innovation, training rigor, and tactical flexibility. By May 1943, the Corsair had begun to assert dominance over the Solomon skies. Japanese formations, once confident in their superiority, increasingly engaged in defensive tactics, attempting to preserve pilots rather than achieve aggressive objectives. Encounters became fewer but more intense, each sortie a trial of nerve, skill, and firepower. The reputation of the gull-winged fighter grew, spreading quickly among Japanese ranks and seeping into strategic calculations. The once derided aircraft had become a weapon that demanded respect, reshaping the dynamics of aerial combat in the Pacific. Through these months, the transformation was clear. The Corsair had evolved from an experimental aircraft, plagued by early teething problems, into a symbol of industrial ingenuity, tactical innovation, and unrelenting firepower. Japanese pilots, once dismissive, recognized that their assumptions had been flawed. They had underestimated not just a machine, but an entire system. pilot training, strategic doctrine, and industrial output, all coalescing into a weapon that could survive, strike, and dominate. The lessons of April and May 1943 would echo throughout the Pacific campaign. The Corsair, once mocked as a waist-high gull, had proven its mettle against Japan's finest. From mockery came respect, from respect, fear. The stage was set for the aircraft to redefine air combat, not just in the Solomons, but across the Pacific, where the combination of pilot skill, industrial might, and superior design would gradually tip the balance in favor of the Allies. June 1943. The Solomons campaign had reached a critical stage. Henderson Field and nearby Allied airstrips were under constant threat from Japanese air operations. Yet the gull-winged Corsairs were no longer the awkward, balky aircraft the Zeros had first encountered. VMF 121, VMF 123, and other marine fighter squadrons had transformed their understanding of the aircraft, developing tactics that fully leveraged the F4U's high-speed dives, powerful Pratt and Whitney R2800 engines, and concentrated 50-caliber firepower. The Japanese, meanwhile, had been forced to rethink long-standing doctrines that had once ensured dominance. Lieutenant Thomas "Tommy" Reynolds, a rookie pilot with just 75 hours in the Corsair, was briefed on the day's sortie over the Russell Islands. Intelligence indicated a flight of 120s operating in a high-altitude patrol, veterans of prior engagements in New Georgia. Captain James McAllister, commanding the mission, emphasized energy retention and disciplined attack runs. "Remember, you're not trying to outturn them," he said. "You're faster, heavier, and you hit harder. Boom, zoom, and stay above." It was a mantra repeated countless times, a principle drilled into every pilot. The initial sighting occurred at 26,000 feet, just below cloud cover. The Zeros, agile and familiar with the Pacific's thermal currents, were immediately on alert. Lieutenant Hiroshi Kagawa, leading the Japanese flight, signaled a climb to engage, confident that his squadron's superior maneuverability would allow them to trap the Corsairs in a turning engagement. The Americans held formation, maintaining altitude advantage and observing the enemy's formation integrity. It was a delicate balance. Too early an attack, and they would waste energy. Too late, and the Zeros could exploit their superior turning radius. The engagement began with a classic boom and zoom attack. Reynolds, flying wingman to McAllister, felt the raw power of the Corsair's engine as he pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft surged forward, leaving the Zeros struggling to match the speed in a vertical climb. McAllister's lead pass was devastating. A concentrated burst from his 50-caliber machine guns shredded a Zero's fuselage. The wings peeled away in a spray of metal, and the pilot was forced to bail out, his parachute barely visible against the green ocean below. The other Zeros recoiled, instinctively adjusting their attack angles, signaling caution that had not been present weeks earlier. The psychological effect on Japanese pilots was immediate. Reports captured post-war indicate that airmen experienced heightened stress in the presence of Corsairs, with many documenting hesitation in attack and unusual caution in maneuvering. Lieutenant Kagawa, in his war diary, wrote, "The American aircraft does not fight as we expected. Its firepower is relentless. One mistake and you are gone. We adjust, but our instincts, our training tell us we are vulnerable." The once dismissed gull-winged fighter had become a terror in the sky, its reputation preceding each sortie. Post-mission debriefings were thorough. Each pilot meticulously recorded speed, altitude, engagement range, and gun convergence settings. Reynolds reviewed gun camera footage alongside McAllister and noted patterns in Zero responses. "They always try to climb above us," he observed. "They think that gives them advantage. But that's when we have the energy to hit them as they level out. Stay high, dive fast, and your rounds count." This methodical approach reflected a critical lesson. The Corsair's design demanded an equally precise tactical doctrine. The aircraft was a tool of industrial ingenuity, requiring disciplined execution to achieve full effectiveness. June and July 1943 saw saw a series of engagements that marked the turning point in Pacific aerial warfare. VMF 123, operating from Efate and Guadalcanal, reported sustained success against veteran Japanese pilots, including multiple aces with prior experience in China and the Philippines. One notable engagement occurred on July 12 over Columbangara, where a flight of 16 Corsairs intercepted 20 Zeros conducting a reconnaissance sweep. The Americans, exploiting superior altitude and energy, executed coordinated diving attacks that destroyed 7 enemy aircraft in under 5 minutes. The remaining Zeros, shaken, disengaged, and retreated toward Bougainville. Japanese post-war interrogation reports confirm the shift in perception. Commander Saburo Sakai, reflecting on engagements during this period, noted, "We laughed at the first Corsairs. They were awkward and unreliable. By June, we realized our laughter was premature. Their speed, their armor, their guns, these are not the same aircraft we saw months ago. They punish mistakes without mercy." The combination of pilot training, tactical discipline, and the R-2800 engine's raw horsepower had turned the tide, ensuring that the F4U could withstand punishment and deliver destruction that the lightly armored Zero could not endure. The F4U's survivability became increasingly evident. Numerous accounts describe aircraft returning from missions riddled with bullet holes, yet fully controllable. Lieutenant Frank Dugan recalled a July 23 sortie. "My left aileron was almost gone, my rudder shot full of holes, but the engine held. I made it back because the Corsair can take hits that would down any other fighter we've flown." We began to understand the aircraft wasn't just fast, it's unbreakable in ways the Japanese never anticipated. This durability fundamentally altered the dynamics of air combat. Where the Zero relied on agility and pilot skill, the Corsair introduced endurance, firepower, and structural resilience into the equation. By late July, the USMC and US Navy had codified a series of tactical doctrines, emphasizing high-speed diving attacks, coordinated formation fire, and energy retention. Pilots were trained to exploit the aircraft's strengths while minimizing exposure to the Zero's turning advantage. The results were decisive. The Japanese, forced to fight defensively, saw a growing attrition rate that their industrial base could not match. By comparison, Corsair units were reinforced regularly, benefiting from US Navy logistics, spare parts, and pilot training programs. The aircraft's presence was not merely tactical, it was strategic. The introduction of drop tanks further extended the Corsair's operational reach. By August 1943, long-range escort missions allowed Marine and Navy pilots to accompany bombers deeper into Japanese-held territory, engaging enemy aircraft on favorable terms. Lieutenant Reynolds participated in one such mission over New Georgia on August 14. With additional fuel extending his range, he intercepted a flight of 6 Zeros approaching Allied bombers. Maintaining altitude advantage and utilizing coordinated fire, his flight destroyed 3 of the 6 Zeros with no losses. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots, seeing Corsairs descending from above, was pronounced. These engagements collectively shifted the balance of air power in the Solomons. Where the Zeros had once dominated the skies, the Corsairs' arrival forced Japanese air leaders to reconsider operational planning. Japanese war diaries and post-war interrogations describe a growing sense of caution and even fear when encountering gull-winged Corsairs. Experienced pilots noted that the aircraft's combination of speed, firepower, and durability was unmatched, creating a battlefield where mistakes were catastrophic. The turning point was not just tactical, it was cultural. The initial laughter at the waist-high gulls gave way to grudging respect and, eventually, terror. By August 1943, Japanese pilots no longer underestimated their opponents. They recognized that Allied aviation was evolving in a way that the Zero, brilliant in design but limited by lightweight construction and minimal armament, could not match. The Corsair was not merely a new fighter. It was a symbol of American industrial ingenuity, training rigor, and tactical innovation. By the end of the chapter, the narrative of mockery had transformed into one of dominance. Corsair pilots, trained in boom and zoom tactics, armed with 2,000 horsepower engines and reinforced by disciplined maintenance and supply chains, had turned the tide over the Solomon Islands. Japanese air power, once confident and unchallenged, now faced an enemy capable of absorbing punishment, striking decisively and reshaping the very nature of Pacific aerial combat. The Solomons campaign had taught a critical lesson. In the Pacific, as in the sky, raw skill alone could no longer guarantee survival. The combination of engineering, firepower, and tactical innovation had become the new measure of air superiority. By late 1943, the Pacific Air War had evolved into a relentless contest of machines and men. The gull-winged F4U Corsair, once a subject of ridicule by veteran Mitsubishi A6M Zero pilots in the Solomons, had cemented its reputation as a game-changing fighter. No longer an awkward newcomer, the Corsair now represented the pinnacle of American engineering, combining raw speed, devastating firepower, and remarkable survivability. Its 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney R2800 double wasp engine gave it a climb rate and acceleration unmatched by most Japanese aircraft, and its 850 caliber M2 Browning machine guns delivered a concentrated volley that Japanese pilots came to fear. The campaign over the Central Pacific Islands, particularly Tarawa, Makin, and the Gilberts, presented new challenges. American forces were executing a strategy of island hopping, seizing forward bases to support naval and air operations deeper into Japanese-held territory. Corsair units were tasked with providing air cover for amphibious landings, engaging enemy fighters, and suppressing anti-aircraft defenses. In these operations, pilots quickly realized that the Corsair's strength, speed, firepower, and ruggedness could be exploited in a variety of roles beyond pure air superiority. Captain Robert Bob Whitman of VMF 214, known as the famed Black Sheep Squadron, recalled the first major Central Pacific engagement in November 1943. Leading a flight of 6 Corsairs over Tarawa, Whitman spotted a formation of 14 Zeros conducting a routine patrol. The Japanese pilots, confident in their maneuverable aircraft and seasoned by months of combat, approached with the expectation of another easy engagement. Whitman's flight, however, executed a textbook boom and zoom attack. The first pass shredded 2 Zeros instantly. The remaining aircraft attempted evasive maneuvers but could not outpace the Corsairs in a straight dive. Within 10 minutes, 4 more Japanese fighters were destroyed, with the remaining Zeros retreating under heavy fire. These encounters reinforced the lessons learned in the Solomons. The Corsair's structural strength allowed it to absorb hits that would have downed a Zero or a Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa. Its armor-protected cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks, and rugged airframe meant that pilots could engage aggressively, confident that a few hits would not compromise their aircraft. Lieutenant James Jimmy O'Connor, flying over Makin Atoll, returned with over 60 rounds embedded in his fuselage and a severely damaged wing. Yet, the Corsair handled predictably, and O'Connor brought it safely back to base. These survival stories became legendary among pilots, contributing to the growing mythos of the aircraft. Tactics evolved alongside experience. Corsair pilots developed coordinated fire patterns, often using a combination of altitude advantage and diving attacks to maximize the effectiveness of their machine guns. Instead of dogfighting in tight turns with Zeros, pilots relied on speed and surprise. High-speed passes allowed them to deliver lethal bursts and disengage before the enemy could respond effectively. By early 1944, these tactics were codified in the Marine Corps and Navy fighter manuals, ensuring that even relatively inexperienced pilots could exploit the Corsair's advantages. The psychological impact on Japanese aviators was profound. Post-war interviews with members of the Japanese 3rd Air Group, who had operated in the Central Pacific, describe a growing fear of the gull-winged monsters. Veteran pilot Lieutenant Toshio Sato recalled in 1945, "At first, we laughed at their heavy aircraft. They could not turn, we said. We could climb faster, dive better, and outfight them. But after Makin and Tarawa, we understood. Their guns do not miss. They come down from the clouds and tear you apart before you can react. One mistake is death." These testimonies highlight how quickly the perception of the Corsair transformed from a comical curiosity to a formidable threat. Allied intelligence and post-mission analysis confirmed the operational superiority of the F4U. Gun camera, footage and mission reports were meticulously reviewed to determine optimal engagement ranges, energy retention strategies, and formation patterns. Pilots like Whitman and O'Connor began to experiment with coordinated attacks on Japanese bomber formations, particularly the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers. A single squadron of 6 Corsairs could, using altitude advantage and synchronized fire, decimate bomber groups before they reached American landing zones or ships. The combination of firepower and speed rendered many traditional Japanese offensive tactics obsolete. The Corsairs' impact was not limited to air-to-air combat. Ground attack operations increasingly leveraged the aircraft's survivability and armament. By January 1944, squadrons operating from newly captured airfields in the Gilberts began strafing Japanese positions, supply lines, and fortifications. A single F4U could carry a variety of ordnance, including 2 100-pound bombs or a complement of rockets. These missions often preceded amphibious landings, softening enemy positions and reducing casualties among infantry units. Japanese soldiers quickly learned to fear the approach of Corsairs as much as their own artillery. One significant example occurred during the Tarawa campaign in November 1943. Marine Corps records report that Corsairs flying high-altitude cover and low-level strafing missions destroyed 46 supply vehicles, several artillery emplacements, and multiple machine gun nests within the first 24 hours of the invasion. Surviving Japanese accounts describe the sound of the R-2000, 800 engines, as an unmistakable harbinger of destruction. A sergeant in the Imperial Japanese Army noted, "The roar of those planes is inescapable. They strike from above with guns and bombs. We are no match for their speed or their fire. We hide and hope." The psychological effect was as critical as the physical damage inflicted. By mid-1944, the Corsair had become synonymous with Allied air superiority in the Central Pacific. The aircraft's performance, once questioned by skeptics, had proven decisive across multiple campaigns. Its combination of raw horsepower, structural strength, and tactical flexibility allowed American forces to seize islands, protect naval and amphibious operations, and attrit Japanese air power at an unsustainable rate. Post-war assessments by the U.S. Census, Strategic Bombing Survey, and the National World War II Museum Archives confirm the correlation between Corsair deployment and reduced Japanese air and ground resistance. The transition from ridicule to dominance was complete. Japanese Zeros, once confident in their superiority, were now forced into defensive, reactive roles. Veteran pilots who had once mocked the waist-high gulls found themselves repeatedly outclassed in both performance and tactical innovation. The F4U Corsair, far from a flawed experiment, had become a symbol of American industrial capacity, pilot training excellence, and tactical ingenuity, a tangible embodiment of the strategic principle that superior engineering, when coupled with rigorous doctrine and preparation, could decisively overcome even the most agile and experienced adversaries. By the end of Chapter 5, the narrative of the Pacific Air War over the Central Pacific Islands demonstrates a complete shift. The Corsair, initially laughed at by seasoned Japanese aviators, had transformed into an instrument of strategic dominance, setting the stage for subsequent operations in the Marianas, Philippines, and beyond. It was no longer merely a fighter, it was a tool of attrition, a psychological weapon, and a testament to the ability of American industry, training, and tactical evolution to redefine the balance of power in the Pacific theater. By June 1944, the Central Pacific had become a proving ground for American air power, and the F4U Corsair stood at the forefront of the campaign. The Marianas Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were strategic linchpins, enabling long-range B-29 operations against the Japanese home islands. Corsair units were deployed en masse, tasked with neutralizing Japanese air opposition and providing close air support for amphibious landings. What had once been experimental aircraft, dismissed as overweight and unstable, now operated as precision weapons in coordinated formations, their 2,000 horsepower engines screaming across the skies. Japanese pilots of the 6th and 201st Air Groups initially attempted to leverage the Zero's famed agility, climbing to engage American fighters in traditional turning battles. But the Corsairs' boom and zoom tactics, perfected in the Solomons and Gilberts, rendered these maneuvers ineffective. Captain Donald Don Sweeney, leading VMF 124 over Saipan, recalled a June 15 sortie. "We caught them climbing. They expected a dogfight, but we simply dove from 20,000 feet, fired, and were gone before they could respond. One squadron we engaged lost 6 aircraft in less than 5 minutes. The concentrated fire of 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns was devastating, often disintegrating the lightly armored Zeros in seconds. The psychological impact on Japanese aviators was immediate. Surviving records from the Imperial Japanese Navy describe increasing reluctance to engage Corsairs above 15,000 feet, fearing the destructive power of high-altitude dives. Lieutenant Masayuki Saito of the 201st Air Group recounted post-war. "We laughed at the gull-winged planes when they first appeared. By the Marianas, that laughter had turned to dread. They attack from above, with a rain of bullets we cannot evade. One pass and comrades vanish before our eyes. Beyond air-to-air combat, Corsairs excelled in ground attack. During the invasion of Tinian, VMF 214 conducted low-altitude strafing runs on Japanese artillery emplacements and troop concentrations. With bombs, rockets, and machine guns, a single flight of 6 Corsairs could eliminate fortified positions in minutes, clearing the way for Marines advancing on the beaches. Reports indicate that in the first week alone, Corsair strikes destroyed 58 artillery pieces, 120 trucks, and numerous defensive positions, with minimal aircraft losses. The Marianas campaign confirmed a critical reality. The Corsairs' combination of speed, durability, and firepower had shifted the balance in the Pacific. Japanese pilots, once dominant in early 1942-43, found themselves consistently outmatched. By the time Saipan fell in July 1944, the F4U had not only established air superiority, but had also demonstrated the effectiveness of American industrial production, pilot training, and tactical innovation. The once mocked gull-winged fighter had become a symbol of American aerial dominance and a nightmare for Japanese aviators. By October 1944, the Philippines campaign had begun, and the skies over Leyte were primed for what would become the largest naval air engagement of the Pacific War. The Imperial Japanese Navy, desperate to halt the American advance, launched waves of aircraft from multiple airfields and carriers. Among the defenders of the Leyte beachheads were squadrons of F4U Corsairs, now battle-hardened veterans of hundreds of combat missions, their pilots trained in formation flying, deflection shooting, and combined arms tactics honed in the Solomons, the Marianas, and New Guinea. The Japanese air arm, including units from the 201st and 6th Air Groups, had suffered irreplaceable losses in aircraft and experienced pilots. Many surviving aviators now carried out kamikaze missions, their Zeros converted into flying bombs. Initial encounters demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of the Corsairs' firepower. Lieutenant Robert M. Johnson, leading VMF 214 on October 25, recalled, "We were vectored onto incoming Zeros. They came screaming at 350 knots. One pass, our guns opened, and the lead aircraft was shredded before it could hit anything. Every sortie, we saw the same planes vanished in a wall of 50-caliber fire." Unlike earlier in the war, Japanese pilots could no longer rely on maneuverability. The Corsairs' 2,000 horsepower, Pratt and Whitney R2000, 800 engines allowed sustained high-speed dives, while its robust airframe could absorb battle damage that would have destroyed a Zero outright. Captain William R. Stovall described observing a Zeke take multiple hits to the fuselage and wings. "It tried to pull away, but the airframe couldn't survive our firepower. It disintegrated in the air. We saw this repeatedly. It became routine: kill or be killed. Nothing else mattered. Ground attacks were equally devastating. Corsairs carried bombs, rockets, and incendiary ordnance, capable of obliterating entrenched positions, artillery emplacements, and vehicle columns. During the Leyte landings, VMF 112 destroyed dozens of trucks and artillery pieces with precision, often in single strafing runs, clearing paths for the advancing U.S. Army. Marine units. The combination of superior high-altitude performance, firepower, and ruggedness turned the F4U into a weapon unmatched in the Pacific theater. The cumulative effect of Corsair dominance was both tactical and psychological. Japanese pilots reported acute fear before engaging, often breaking off attacks when confronted with well-formed American fighter screens. Interrogation reports from captured aviators reveal a stark acknowledgement. The once feared Zero could no longer dictate the air. They climb, dive, fire, and vanish, one pilot noted. We cannot fight them in the way we fought in 1942. It is no longer a contest, it is execution. By the end of October 1944, the battle for Leyte Gulf had established a pattern that would persist through the Philippines campaign. Corsairs delivered air superiority, annihilated kamikaze threats, and systematically destroyed Japanese aircraft on the ground. The aircraft, once dismissed as a gull-winged oddity, had become a symbol of relentless American power, illustrating how training, industrial production, and tactical innovation had overturned Japanese confidence built during the early months of the Pacific War. By the spring of 1945, the American advance had reached Okinawa, the last major stepping stone before the Japanese home islands. The stakes were high. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army had marshaled every remaining air asset, determined to inflict catastrophic losses on the approaching Allied fleet. Kamikaze tactics, once sporadic, had become systematic. Entire formations of Zeros and modified bombers were deliberately packed with explosives, piloted by men expected to die for the Emperor. For the Japanese, Okinawa represented both desperation and honor. For the American pilots flying Vought F4U Corsairs, it would be the ultimate test of aircraft and training. The Corsair, now in its F4U4 and FG1D variants, had been perfected. The 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney R2000, 800 engines enabled unprecedented climb rates and high-speed diving capability. Armor plating around the cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks rendered it nearly impervious to the 50 caliber and 20 mm fire that had devastated Zeros early in the war. Armament of 6 to 8 Browning M2 machine guns, each with 450 rounds of ammunition, allowed pilots to deliver concentrated firepower that annihilated attacking aircraft in seconds. In contrast, the Japanese planes, worn by repeated sorties and poorly maintained due to supply shortages, had lost the tactical edge that had dominated the skies in 1942. On April 1st, the invasion of Okinawa began. From the moment the first landings occurred, the air over the beaches became a maelstrom. Japanese kamikaze squadrons launched hundreds of aircraft from Okinawa, Kyushu, and distant carrier remnants. Lieutenant Colonel Robert S. Johnson, flying with VMF 311, described the chaos. They came like waves, hundreds of planes screaming in from all directions. But we had altitude, we had speed, and we had the firepower. One burst from 6 guns, and the lead aircraft disintegrated. Then the next, and the next. It became a grim pattern. Each sortie, we saw the same thing. Planes destroyed in seconds, pilots never reaching their targets. The Corsairs employed tactics that maximized both firepower and survivability. Rather than dogfighting with nimble but fragile aircraft, pilots relied on energy advantage, diving from high altitude, maintaining speed, and using their guns to deliver lethal, pre-measured bursts. Formation discipline was crucial. Squadrons covered each other's tails, ensuring that kamikazes were intercepted before reaching American ships. Even when Zeros penetrated the fighter screens, Corsairs' armor and radial engines allowed pilots to absorb multiple hits and return to base. Lieutenant John W. Baker recalled returning with 3 inches of shrapnel through his wing and fuselage. The plane shuddered, the guns jammed, but she still flew. I landed on 3 wheels, and it was still whole enough to fly again. I realized that these planes weren't just fighters, they were flying tanks. Naval records from Task Force 58 confirm the effectiveness of the Corsair in this role. In the first month of the Okinawa campaign, Marine and Navy Corsairs destroyed over 200 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, while inflicting catastrophic losses on kamikaze pilots attempting to strike ships. Aircraft carriers, battleships, and transports were shielded by a combination of radar-directed fighters and relentless Corsair patrols. Ships that would have been sitting targets in 1942 survived, their decks largely unscathed despite waves of suicidal attackers. Ground attacks against Japanese positions on Okinawa further demonstrated the versatility of the Corsair. The aircraft's 6 to 8 50 caliber guns, coupled with rockets and bombs, devastated artillery positions, trucks, and fortified bunkers. In the hands of trained pilots, a single Corsair could eliminate dozens of vehicles and gun emplacements in a single strafing run, clearing paths for advancing infantry and reducing casualties. Lieutenant Colonel William R. Tharp described one mission near Shuri. "We came in low, fired rockets into the hilltop positions, strafed the roads below. The ground shook, smoke and fire everywhere. We were killing their mobility before they could even react.